Welcome, everyone. Welcome. While we're waiting for folks to trickle in, and there are lots of you, and it's just wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you for coming. While we're waiting for folks to trickle in, feel free to share your name and the lands that you're calling in from in the chat. We highly encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous lands that you reside on, and you can begin that learning at the link that will be shared in the chat. It's native-lands.ca. And for those of you who are just joining us, we are sharing our names and lands that we're calling in from in the chat, and you can utilize the resource that's being shared to learn more about the Indigenous lands that you call home, that you reside on. We're going to give it just another maybe 10, 15 seconds or so, and then we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to share today, and I am so excited to get started. And for those of you who are just coming in, we are sharing our names and the lands that we're calling in from in the chat. Alrighty. Well, I think we'll get started. We have a lot of really amazing information to share with you all today, and I'm just so thrilled to be here. I wanted to just say welcome. Welcome to all of you. It's so great to share this space with each and every one of you. My name is Sydney Anderson. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for the Community Wildlife Habitat Team at the National Wildlife Federation, and I am calling in from the lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples, also known as Golden, Colorado. I just wanted to take a second to quickly thank a few people. I wanted to thank my team, the Community Wildlife Habitat team, and my department, the Education and Engagement Department, for supporting this webinar. And I especially wanted to shout out and thank my amazing colleague, Samantha Miller, for all of her support in making this webinar happen. She's also working her wizardly magic on the back end today, so she's going to be sharing resources with you all and monitoring the chat. And I also really wanted to thank NWF's free prior and informed consent manager, John Naranjo, who provided some really critical feedback on the slides today. So thank you so much, John. And then I wanted to thank all of you for being here in celebration in honor of Indigenous Heritage Month to learn more about intergenerational knowledge and the cultural biodiversity of seeds. I really cannot emphasize enough just what an honor it is to share this space with Rowen White, and I am personally so looking forward to learning from Rowen's expertise as a seed keeper, seed steward, and storyteller. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about her strategies for seed saving across our communities, as I'm sure you are as well. I'm going to move over to the next slide. Here we go. And just a couple of Zoom reminders. Please remain muted for the duration of the presentation today. And if you would also keep your camera turned off, that'll help with bandwidth. There are a lot of you. There are over 90 of you at this point, which is so fantastic to see. And then if you have any questions at all throughout the presentation, you can add them in the Q&A box. It can be found at the bottom of your Zoom window, and then we will do our best to get to all of your questions during the Q&A portion of our time together today. Next, we wanted to uplift a brand new NWF resource. It's a blog that was published last week that serves as a reminder that while November is Native American Heritage Month, Indigenous heritage is more than just a month. And it's really important that Indigenous ecological knowledge ways, cultures, and sovereignty must be recognized and valued always, not just during the month of November. And this blog also, it highlights some really incredible examples of NWF's programmatic and partnership work with Indigenous communities and tribal leaders across the country. And then it also provides some tangible opportunities for you to get involved in supporting Indigenous-led movements as well. So we highly recommend that you check out this resource, and we're going to put a link to that in the chat, and you can feel free to share that widely with your networks as well. And then before I hand things over to Rowen for the next 45 or so minutes, we wanted to really ground our time together today by emphasizing the National Wildlife Federation's commitment to the Tribal and Indigenous Partnerships Enhancement Strategy, which is also known as TIPES. In the TIPES report, it sets actionable steps and goals for the National Wildlife Federation to prioritize and forge authentic relationships and partnerships with Indigenous leaders across the country that are to advance Indigenous policy priorities, to help create and achieve greater place space conservation, and then to help rectify historic environmental injustices, which are very much needed. And this report itself is really guided by 3 pillars, and those pillars are intergenerational knowledge, food sovereignty, and water protection. And we're really excited to dive in to 2 of those 3 pillars with all of you today. If you look closely at this graphic here, you'll notice that those 3 pillars themselves, they first and foremost, they stem from a foundation of free, prior, and informed consent. And since so much of our shared work is relational and it's place-based, it's located in community, it's based in community, we really wanted to emphasize the importance of this foundational ethic. So free, prior, and informed consent is really this prerequisite. It's a prerequisite for working with any community partner, but it's especially critical when building relationships with Indigenous partners, communities, and Indigenous-led organizations. And there's a really, really good reason for this. And that reason is that there's been a long history of mistrust, misappropriation, dispossession, and injustice that's occurred from harmful partnership between scientific research, conservation, and then the subsequent degradation of traditional ecological knowledge in Indigenous communities. And it's really, really important that in our work we ensure that doesn't happen again. So if you just join me in reading the definition here that you can see on the screen, free, prior, and informed consent describes processes that are free from manipulation or coercion or paternalistic persuasion. They're informed by adequate and timely information and occur sufficiently prior to a decision so that Indigenous rights and interests can be incorporated or addressed effectively as a part of the decision-making process. And there really is so much more that can be said on this topic. But for the sake of time and to get to our amazing keynote speaker, I will conclude with a reminder that consent can be reevaluated and revoked at any time, and that we must always strive to move at the speed of healthy relationship and trust building, which is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And with all of that, it is now my greatest honor and privilege to introduce our incredible guest speaker, Rowen White. Rowen is a seed keeper, farmer, and author from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne. Rowen is a passionate activist for Indigenous seed and food sovereignty, and she is the creative director of Sierra Seeds, an innovative Indigenous seed bank and land-based educational organization. Rowen is also the founder of the Indigenous SeedKeepers Network, which is committed to restoring the Indigenous seed commons. She believes that by cultivating creative, supportive learning spaces, reclaiming narratives, and practicing radical imagination, we can work together to seed the change for a more equitable, relational, and kin-centric food system that centers around a deep sense of belonging and connection. You can follow Rowen's journeys at sierraseeds.org, and we'll put that in the chat. Rowen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing it with us. And with that, I will stop my screen share and I will turn things over to you. Thanks.
I'm going to unmute myself and I am going to share my screen. So that way I'm going to bring some beauty into the space. Oh, let's see here. Wrong one. Can you see the screen here? Give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone. Sego, Sewagwego, Ganyat Daho Yungyats. I just introduced you in my Indigenous language of Ganyat Geha. I come from a small Mohawk community right on the New York-Canadian border. Half of our community is in Canada, in both Ontario and Quebec. And the other half is in the United States, in New York State. And it's a beautiful place, a beautiful people. And so I really come here honoring this people. So first and foremost, I hold myself accountable to my community as an Indigenous woman. I come here representing my clan, which is Snipe Clan, my community, which is our Mohawk Akwesasne community, and our ancestors and descendants. So I really wanted to bring some pictures of my ancestors here in this space who really seated in the earth of my body, my passion and desire to stay connected to our ancestral foodways and our traditions These are my great-grandparents sitting on the porch there. They were farmers and land stewards. Some of my other relatives, my great-grandparents on my other side, who lived on a small island in the St. Lawrence. And so, to them, as my words say on the screen, their hands planted seeds and harvested foods and swaddled babies and fixed fences and wept at passings and were thankful at births. And so I'm thankful for all the memories that live inside my body. And so my hands and my work is an extension of the work that they so beautifully did in the face of really unspeakable atrocities. My grandparents were survivors of residential schools where their culture and language was taken from them, and their connection to the earth was, in the terms of livelihood and farming, was severed in that way. And so I return to this good work of tending to seeds in the land, really in honor of all that they did to keep those memories and those skills and that way of life going in the face of great cultural upheaval here in the United States. I also come here representing the work that I do. As Sydney had shared, I am one of many founders of the Indigenous SeedKeepers Network. I brought a bunch of not all of them, but a bunch of my colleagues and compadres and friends here into the space so that I can honor my elders and those who teach me. Not all of my mentors are elders. Some of them are young people who are working alongside us. So we are a loose coalition of intertribal seed keepers and farmers across North America who are leaning into solidarity and skill sharing and in our ability to continue to seed the future for food sovereignty and seed sovereignty that is done through a cultural lens, like that we are simultaneously revitalizing and restoring our seeds and our connection to land, as well as restoring and revitalizing our culture, again, in the face of great cultural upheaval because of colonialism in North America. So we work with hundreds of different tribes across Turtle Island, and it is a distinct pleasure to work alongside each and every one of these folks. We do programming, mentorship, facilitation, capacity building, workshops. We have a very educational focus, but and I'll share a little bit more of some of the stories of our work too. I also have the honor of stewarding a 10-acre farm in the Sierra Foothills in Northern California. We have an educational farm called Sierra Seeds, which really aims at not only stewarding in a very living seed bank, and we're going to talk about what that means throughout our time together. Not seeds sort of put into frozen vaults or, seed banks, but in the day-to-day soil of our everyday lives. That is how we maintain and steward and are in relationship with our Indigenous seed bank on our land. But at the heart of what we do is that we aim to grow that next generation of seed stewards. So we center mentorship and education and creating beautiful spaces where a number of different folks from across the movement can come together and learn how to better care for the seeds and create those conditions for that coevolutionary dance between humans and plants. So we try and cultivate creative learning spaces to do that, both in person and virtual. I would, again, I'd be remiss to not talk about my ancestors, but of course I had to bring my little self here. This is my former self, my little Rowie, as I was called when I was little. And I always had a penchant for getting my hands in the earth and tending to the gardens. And I always think that is the passion of my grandparents and great-grandparents and ancestors who knew that agriculture and tending to the land was such a critical part of what it meant to be Mohawk. And so here I am with my lumpy, bumpy pumpkin, so proud. But as I said, I wasn't raised on a farm because of some of those cultural gaps. But I was always asking my mom if we could have a garden in the backyard. And as a young woman, and I'll share a little bit of that here in a bit, I really began to lean in and be curious about the agricultural traditions of our people and also the heirloom seed inheritance of our people. And so I always say that I have been finding my way home through food and seed as a modern day Indigenous woman, healing intergenerational trauma and reconnecting to our beautiful cultural lifeways through my relationship to land and seed. So I don't think that little me would have known that 25 plus year, I mean, since then, 40 years of my life would be dedicated to continuing to uplift and learn from the seeds themselves, but you never know. At 17, I found myself on an organic farm in Western Massachusetts, which was just a few hours away from my home community where I was raised. And my mentor, Nancy, who was running the CSA farm, a previous intern and student on the farm, had begun this project, which was this heirloom seed tomato project. And so they had a field that was dedicated to growing 50 heirloom tomato varieties in this field. And for me, as somebody who had, only receive seeds from, the burpees, racks at the local nursery, I had no idea that tomatoes came in all these different rainbows of colors and textures and flavors. I only knew tomatoes as round and red or in a can, right? And so I began to leaf through these seed catalogs and these seed packets. I remember my mentor entrusting me to be one who was planting these seeds in the greenhouse. And so I began to familiarize myself with them. And I remember sitting on this dusty farmhouse floor in New England, just poring over these seed catalogs and learning about seeds that were striped or peach and fuzzy or basket shaped or pear shaped. And not only learning about that incredible wellspring of diversity that is held not only inside tomatoes, but of all different vegetables that were inside of these seed catalogs and these books, but also learning that these seeds had lineages and legacies alongside people, that people had been saving these seeds from generation to generation to generation inside of their families, right? So with the tomatoes, those had originally been indigenous to Central America and had been brought across the ocean, the Atlantic, to places like Italy and Spain, where we can't even imagine that food without the tomato in it, even though it's only been a part of their culinary tradition for the last 400 years, right? And then those same tomato seeds that had been grown in the Italian soil for generations then were brought back across the Atlantic Ocean when people were immigrating back over here to North America, because people wanted to bring a little bit of the flavors of home with them, right? Those tomatoes of their grandmother or their grandfather, that flavor of what it meant to be home. And so this was a cornerstone moment for me as a Mohawk woman and as a sort of budding agriculturalist, to recognize that the breadth of biodiversity, which we're going to talk about, and sort of this cultural dimension of it, and then also that plants and people have been co-evolving together in agricultural systems since the dawning of agriculture. And so I began to think, okay, if these different Italian ancestors were passing these seeds of their ancestors down and it ended up in this basket of seeds that I had, what were the seeds and foods that fed my ancestors? And that became a very central question in my work, which ended up leading to me researching it and writing my thesis. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that too. But it really became this driving question of wanting to reconnect in meaningful ways to the diversity of seeds that my ancestors would have stewarded, crops like corn and beans and squash and sunflowers and potatoes and things like that. So what this ended up doing, I ended up going home on breaks, and then I ended up raising a grant through our natural sciences department and beginning to talk with elders and go back home into my community and begin to comb and catalog and find the heirloom seeds that were from my people, the ones that even amidst the changes of the last several decades that foresighted elders had kept in little baby food jars and coffee cans, on their dusty shed shelves. And so I always say these elders, as they began to entrust me with these old heirloom seeds of my ancestors, this beautiful red corn and white corn and speckled beans and striped beans, trusting me as a young woman with these seeds, at a time when it was mostly elders who were keeping the seeds alive. And there was not an interest from young people like myself at 16, 17, coming to those elders and wanting to be a part of keeping that agricultural heritage alive. And so they were excited to see a young woman like myself coming back to them and asking questions in this way. And I always say that those formative years of me getting to know those seeds and growing them and learning the traditional ways that our heirloom seeds would have been grown was a sort of unconventional rites of passage for me, that I apprenticed myself to my non-human kin, these plants, and learned so much from them. And that apprenticeship is ongoing. It's an apprenticeship that I still am engaged in, not only with my seed elders and community members, but also with those plants, learning from them and learning how to be a better steward of them over time. What I did learn in beginning to reconnect with these seeds of my ancestors is that I began to understand their place in our cosmology and in our creation stories and in our cultural memory. So I don't have the time today to be able to really give credit and full attention to our creation story, but this is an artistic rendition of our original ancestor, a woman named Sky Woman, who came from a place called Sky World and ended up landing into this dimension upon the back of a generous turtle, who said that this would be upon his back would be the next place that Sky Woman could live. And she clutched seeds in her hands from the old world and began to sing this new world awake. Again, I'm not going to be able to tell all the intricacies, but over time, she was pregnant, she gives birth to a daughter. That daughter and her begin to, live on this back of this turtle. All these plants are growing and all this beautiful life is emerging, and they're singing the world awake. And soon the daughter becomes impregnated by the west winds. And when it's time for her to give birth, she gives birth to twins. And one is birthed naturally and one is birthed very unnaturally through her armpit. And so in the process, she dies in childbirth. But she says in her dying breaths that from her body would grow the seeds and foods that would continue to feed her descendants, onward throughout time. And from her breasts grew the corn, and from her hands grew the beans, and from her belly button grew the umbilicus squash vines, and from her heart grew the strawberry, and from her head grew the tobacco, and from her legs grew the sunflowers and the original potatoes, which we know of as Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes. And so the reason why I bring this beautiful story in is that it's a reminder that this is one of many creation stories from many different diverse tribes across North America, but we see ourselves as lineal descendants of our traditional seeds and foods. They literally grew from the body of some of our original ancestors. And so it's not a metaphor when we say that these seeds are our relatives. They are literally our relatives, our blood relatives. And so it's our responsibility inside of our ceremonies and our culture and our life ways to continue to reconnect and care for them in this loving way, because those ancestors, those original ancestors, came into these sacred agreements with those seeds that we would, as humans, would take care of them, and the seeds in turn would take care of us, right? And so we are part of this work in our Indigenous SeedKeepers Network is to continue to restore relationship to those beautiful cosmogenealogies and those relationships with seeds for people like myself, to my own tribe's understanding of that. And again, many different tribes have many different cosmovisions and creation stories that also feature their beautiful plants and animals and other food sources. What I think is, sort of the crux of what I wanted to share here is that I think we have to understand the ancestral brilliance and really honor it for the ways in which our ancestors safeguarded biodiversity inside of cultural frameworks and teachings. So I'm showing here a picture of a basket of seeds inside our seed bank, and we have a red corn from my people. And this red corn was tied specifically to a ceremony for our wedding. So we would make a particular type of bread, a cornbread for our wedding. So that would be served there. So in order to have a wedding, you had to have this particular type of corn. the blue corn, for instance, in order to give our babies their names, their traditional names, their spirit names in our ceremonies, we would need to make a certain kind of mush with that particular blue corn that would be fed to the people and to those babies to bestow them their name, right? The multicolored corn would be used in a particular type of children's ceremony. So the seeds were tied and bundled with particular ceremonies in a way that I feel like it safeguarded them throughout the generations, because we knew that those ceremonies and those traditions would endure, because babies would still be born and people would still be wedded, and ceremonies for the children would still happen. And so we sort of safeguarded the diversity of those seeds as we tied them together with our cultural frameworks and teachings. And this is because as we speak about, and again, this is a rendition of our ceremonial cycle. And if you look, our ceremonies directly echo and mirror our foodways traditions, right? In the beginning of midwinter, after we actually have a ceremony called midwinter, where we're actually praying and making blessings for the seeds that are going to be sprouting in the spring. We have our maple ceremony. We have our thunder ceremony, where the thunderers actually energize the earth so that seeds can be planted again, and so on and so forth around the wheel of time. So our ceremonial cycles are our food cycles, right? And so much so that we honor these plants and these seeds in the way that they grow in the world. Anytime you see a bean vine growing up a trellis, like this is a bean vine in my garden growing up a sunflower stalk or a corn stalk or a fence, beans always grow counterclockwise, if you ever notice. And if you haven't noticed that, next time you're able, next season, and you plant a pole bean, kind of like the ones I have behind me here, they always grow counterclockwise around something. It just has to do with the way that the sun and moon move. And so we always say that we dance in our longhouses the same ways that beans dance around corn, right? So we pay homage to those seeds and food plants that so generously give their life for us. What we have to remember is that culture is a collective ongoing practice that supports kinship and reinforces and strengthens that kinship. We also know that ceremonies are the way that we show renewed commitment to and devotion to tending to these reciprocal relationships. And so, therefore, agriculture is cultural work at its core. It's the way that we feed ourselves and shelter ourselves and clothe ourselves is the very wellspring of culture, right? And so it's at the heart of our work. And so when we talk about this cultural dimension of biodiversity, which is at the core of what I wanted to speak about today, what we have to remember is that for all of us humans on the planet, diversity is the root of our resilience, right? If we are to survive the ever-changing face of Mother Earth and throughout her seasons, and especially now in the face of climate change, we know that having diverse seed populations like the one you see here on the screen, so many different types of beans that can be planted and grown in our gardens, that those populations of seed are going to allow us to continue to adapt to the ever-changing face of Mother Earth. And humans have known that for a long time, and that is why we have safeguarded the value of that diversity. That diversity is a core value that Indigenous peoples hold, that we safeguard that diversity inside of our cultural teachings and frameworks, as I had shared with you before. And so I think it's really important in a time where we see the industrial food system and farming system going more and more towards monoculture and uniformity, I think we have to look to the ancestral brilliance of our ancestors and see that they valued diversity because it was enduring and sustainable and allowed our people to thrive and prosper on the land. I love looking at maps, and maps tell stories. And these particular maps on the screen tell a particular story, which is that, so Indigenous peoples, we are 4% of the world's population who reside on about a quarter, just slightly under 22% of the Earth's surface. And on that land is 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, right? So Indigenous peoples are stewarding an overwhelming amount of biodiversity inside of our communities because we have that cultural value of diversity being critical and important, right? And the relationships are our existence is predicated on that particular relationship to biodiversity. The top map here shows a mapping of all the biodiversity hotspots on the globe, right? The places that are colored in are the places where biodiversity still is thriving, both agricultural biodiversity and wild plant biodiversity. The bottom map here shows the places where Indigenous languages are still being spoken, which is a cultural marker of Indigenous cultural intactness. And so those maps are nearly similar, right? They mirror one another. And so again, it's just another way of saying the statistic that I just shared. So what we can deduce from that is that Indigenous, when we allow Indigenous peoples to continue to steward land and steward seeds in place in their ancestral homelands, these become enclaves of both cultural and climate sanity, because that diversity is what allows us to continue to adapt and co-evolve to a landscape that's ever changing. And so this is as Pamela McElwee says, this is a watershed moment in acknowledging Indigenous and local communities and the role that they play in maintaining and managing biodiversity and landscapes that the rest of us can learn from. And the other thing that I want to mention is that not only is it people who engage in agriculture, but there's a different sort of agriculture that Indigenous peoples have engaged in wild spaces, in quote unquote wild spaces, forests, oak savannas, prairies, through burning and a multitude of other cultural practices. There was a sort of agriculture or a shaping of the land that humans engaged in reciprocity with the landscape. And so that's also included. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that as well. So again, just to reiterate, our resilience is rooted in this diversity, and intact Indigenous cultures safeguard and culturally encode the value of this diversity, which is the root of our resilience. So if nothing else, I think it's really important for us to remember that. So Indigenous polyculture, so we talked about monoculture and sort of the straight row, like, acres and acres of corn or soybean that makes up the industrial food system or the industrial agricultural system in North America and across the globe. Well, Indigenous people have been engaged in polyculture, which means that a multitude of different crops and species of foods and wild plants coexist in the same field. And Indigenous polyculture connects both wild edges and domesticated gardens. And so these gardens become enclaves of diversity that are safeguarded by cultural practices and values. So many of you have probably heard of the Three Sisters way of planting. And so, but also if you've been in Mexico or Central America, you've seen perhaps milpa fields where there are a multitude of different crops, or, forest gardens, and all sorts of different ways in which a multitude of crops are grown in one place. And again, I bring this slide in because this was part of some of my original research that I was doing back as a teenage girl into my early 20s. I stumbled upon this book that was written by a man in early 1900s, and it was called Iroquois Foods and Food Preparation. And it was a man named F.W. Waugh. And what he was doing at that time was he was documenting the food and seed traditions of our people. And he wrote a whole book about it. And in the back of that book, I found these old plates that had, I think in future publications, had been kind of colorized. I think at the time of publication, they were in black and white. But I remember finding these plates. There was one with beans and some with squashes and this one with corn. And I remember finding this and scanning and photocopying these and using this, going back into my community as sort of a scavenger hunt, like going to different elders and asking them if they remembered some of these particular varieties and if they still tended to them and cared for them. So that became this sort of, again, the scavenger hunt that I was on as a young woman to try and reconnect and restore an ancestral or heirloom seed bundle. And what I began to realize is that that foresighted elders had kept these seeds alive, again, even amidst the crazy cultural upheaval of the last century. And this photo on the opposite side is an educational poster that one of my seed elders, Steve McCumber, who's a Mohawk elder from the community of Gotnawage, he made for classrooms so that that Mohawk students could learn about the diversity of seeds that were continuing to be stewarded in our communities. So what I learned is that between 100+ years of when this man had come into our community thinking that our communities were on the decline and perhaps some of these things would be extinct, that these seeds were still being kept alive by foresighted elders who understood that they played such a critical role in who we were as Mohawk people on the land. And so it's just a testament to that Indigenous resilience and our connection with our seed relatives. And so it's important, in this time we've read articles about the global seed vault in Svalbard in the Arctic, or, seed banks through the USDA or public access ones. It's important to remember that it's not enough to save heritage seeds. The culture of those people to whom each seed belongs to must be kept alive along with their seeds and cultivation. Not in freezers or museums, but in the soil of our everyday lives, which is something that my mentor, Martine Prichtel, so eloquently shared. So again, we're going to go back to this idea of polyculture, because I think, this is something that springboards us into, what can we all do as people who I assume that all of us who've showed up are either gardeners or farmers or people interested in, keeping important biodiversity alive. And so, this next kind of string of slides, and what I'd love to share is how are we beginning to reintegrate some of this Indigenous wisdom into our communities and creating those enclaves of biodiversity. Indigenous polyculture gardens from my tradition are often called Three Sisters gardens in North America. But I think what's important to remember is that it goes beyond just the Three Sisters. An elder of mine once told me, I think they said that, yeah, we have our three sisters, which are corn, beans, and squash, but we also have our fourth sister and brother and cousins, which are all the different other types of foods that grow inside of our traditional gardens, which some are domesticated crops and some of them are weeds that are vitally important to our diet as well. So some of those seeds, as elders share with me, some of the seeds, were gifted from our original ancestor, the corn, beans, and squash. But some of those wild plants, they never wanted to be necessarily domesticated, but they always popped up in places where soil was disturbed to create a garden. And so they were always there anyway, right? And they were adding important nutrients and important minerals to our diets as well. So I think when we think about Three Sisters, we have to remember that inside of these gardens, there's a multitude of diversity, not only with just plants, right, but also pollinators and animals and, all kinds of different relatives, soil microorganisms. And so again, the gardens represent a much deeper layers of diversity, which is kind of what I wanted to lean into a little here, which is we have the diversity in the garden. We have a multitude, of different corn, beans, squashes, tobaccos, sunflowers, and all of these different traditional crops, right? And it's not just, so we have diversity inside of that. So it's not just one type of corn that we plant. Sometimes we might plant two different types of corn in succession in different times. Like for me, in my community, we'll sometimes plant a really long season corn at the beginning of our season, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, we might plant a second planting of corn that's a shorter season corn, and we might have 2 different types of corn in the garden that are pollinating at different times. And so we can still have that diversity of different corns in our garden. Beans who self-pollinate, we can often be growing a handful up to a dozen of different types of beans in our garden at any one time, right? Squashes grow in, there are 5 different species of squash that don't cross-pollinate. And so we can be growing 4 to 5 different species of and varieties of squash in our garden at any one time. So again, there's just these layers of diversity of the seeds that we plant inside of our garden. But then we have to acknowledge and remember the diversity that is in the edges and the paths of our gardens, right? So all of those beautiful, tender annual herbs that spring up, the dandelions, the edible weeds, all of these sorts of things. And what an amazing sort of bank of diversity that exists on those fertile edges, right? And so continuing to remember that, sometimes we want to sort of weed everything out of our garden, but those weeds are also really important to the whole garden ecosystem. And so it's okay to have a little bit of a messy garden and to have some of those things continuing to be there, not only for us as humans, but for the other pollinators and animals and other beings that are also a part of our garden ecosystem. And then also we look at diversity in the forest edges. So our ancestral gardens were planted near forest edges where, there was just a sort of a natural transition to the woodlands, where we would also be burning underneath the forests in a safe and cultural way. So that way we could continue to nourish that landscape so that it would continue to not only provide foods for us as humans, but also be a beautiful landscape of nourishment for our other non-human relatives. So again, this is perhaps just a reminder or an invitation to allow your gardens to be not just straight rows and clean and neat and tidy, but allow them to be a little wild, right? And allow that diversity to come in that beautiful way. Here's some pictures of sort of some modern day polycultures in my own farm. So we farm on a hillside. We have a big piece of land at the bottom of our farm that's alongside a creek that has beautiful sandy loam soil. But we also have heavy clay soil on a hillside that we've terraced and created these sort of sunken beds with some sort of homemade hoop houses over the top. And so these are some pictures of some of those sunken terraced beds where we have a multitude of different layers using the vertical space afforded to us by these hoop houses to trellis tomatoes and other things, bean vines and whatnot. And we have a multitude of different crops, both some that are indigenous to us as Mohawk people, but also incorporating other food crops that we just love and are excited to grow as well. And you can see in the back behind these marigolds, you can see that we have a row of lettuce going to seed. We have, a lot in this particular slide here. You can see this is a holy basil or tulsi going to seed. And we plant that in there largely. I mean, it's an amazing herb, but we also plant that plant in there because it's an incredible pollinator, like sort of apiary or food source for the bees and for the wild pollinators in our area. So again, I think we don't have to limit ourselves to sort of how our ancestors would have planted their Three Sisters garden. I think we can get super creative in how we're planting our gardens and farms, but always remembering to utilize and lean into that diversity and seeing how we can create layers of that diversity inside of our gardens. So suffice it to say, as I said before, seeds are not one size fits all. It matters what seeds you select for your garden, because again, the seeds that were particularly adapted to my home community in upstate New York are going to be different than the seeds that the Hopi people planted in the desert in the Southwest, right? Because it's a different environment. It's a different seasonal cycle. It's a different set of climatic and environmental conditions. So these days, so much of the seed industry is looked at that seeds are one size fits all, right? You go to Home Depot or you go to, online and you order seeds from a seed catalog, and there's no understanding of where those seeds were grown and where they were adapted to. But that's the beauty of seed keeping and seed saving, is that you can save seeds that become in just a few generations adapted to your very particular, to the soil that you are growing in. And so Indigenous seed keepers like myself and others are helping to keep healthy, diverse seed populations thriving and adapting. And we are doing this in real time. We're allowing ourselves to select the seeds that grow well inside of our gardens each and every season. So these are some tomatoes that I grew in my garden. So I wanted to just share a little bit. This looks like this slide sort of overlap, but it's okay. So I just wanted to share a little bit of, demystify a little bit of like when we're thinking about seeds for our garden, what would we be looking for? So open pollinated seeds, as the name would imply, are produced by seeds that have resulted in the natural pollination of a parent plant. So a lot of the times you can just Google open pollinated seeds and find plethora of sources for them. These pollination methods include self-pollination as well as pollination achieved by birds, insects, and other natural means. And after pollination occurs, the seeds are allowed to mature and collected, and they grow true to type if you've isolated them, if they're cross-pollinated. And it means that the plant produced from the collective seed will be very similar to the parent plant in future generations. So it's always good if you want to be on a seed keeping journey, to start with open pollinated seeds versus hybrid seeds who won't always come true to type at the end. Heirloom seeds are open pollinated seeds, but another layer of meaning around that is that they're handed down, just like those tomatoes that I talked about in the beginning. They're handed down from one generation to the next, and because of the flavor or productivity or adaptability or sentimental, something sentimental about who had handed it down. So they've been, some of them have been handed down, like the ones that are in my ancestral bundle have been handed down for hundreds and hundreds of years in our community, right? Some of those tomatoes that I talked about too, had been handed down for many generations. And so, but it's important to remember that all heirloom seeds are open pollinated, but not all open pollinated seeds are heirlooms, because there are new open pollinated seeds that are being introduced and developed, but they might not have some of that cultural layers and history of meaning and cultural memory around them. Another important distinction is understanding what a landrace seed is. So the seed in the slide behind me is a variety that's from the Navajo Nation, and it's called the Navajo robin's egg corn. And I just love it because it looks like a speckled robin's egg. And so, but you can see between those 4 cobs on the screen that there's so much diversity in the in each and every cob. Each and every cob doesn't look different. There's so much inherent diversity. And so this would be considered a landrace. And so many of my ancestral indigenous varieties that I carry in my bundle are also landraces. So they're indigenous to a certain region and develop their characteristics in response to the growing conditions of the area because of the impact of the farmers and all of that, that the environmental pressures, the selection pressures of the environment. And so landraces are site and culturally specific, and they've evolved to withstand climate, pests, diseases, and cultural practices of a locality. So those are vitally important in this time. So you might be asking, well, where might we source seeds for Indigenous gardens? There are community member and seed swaps from community members, or seed swaps from ethical seed companies that do their due diligence to be really responsible with what seeds they're able to have consent to sell and distribute. There are seed libraries all across the country that distribute seeds. There are seed banks, and then there's also an opportunity to ethically wildcraft. And so I know that there's probably lots of resources that NWF has for you all after this. And so what I want to end with is that every garden has the potential to be an island of diversity, and seed keeping is an evolutionary practice that helps tend to this diversity, right? So these can be our gardens that are these beautiful enclaves of diversity. And when we begin to seed keep for these different crops, whether it's 3 sisters like I share here, or the multitude of different varieties that you may want to grow in your garden, that seed keeping is an evolutionary practice that is so critical to have in our tool basket in order to be resilient people on the planet. And so there's a multitude of reasons why seed keeping is important, from keeping these rare seeds alive, to upholding cultural agreements. As we talked about, the seed diversity is so critical to create resilience in our food systems. There's a number of reasons why seed keeping is important and why we do it. And we do this on a level in our work where we go from family to tribal community to intertribal region. We take a very dynamic approach to supporting these layers of stewardship. We send seeds all over the country. We create beautiful seed hubs like this one that's in collaboration with our language and culture immersion school, where young kids have a living classroom where they're learning how to seed keep in real time and how to prepare food and on the farm. Partnering with communities like Pawnee, who are doing something similar in their community, where they're reintroducing these Indigenous seeds back into their community. We work with communities in the Southwest where they're doing similar work, where they're reintroducing these Indigenous seeds back into their community as intergenerational work. Because what we have to remember is that seed work is intergenerational work. So we're centering mentorship and succession to grow that next generation of seed stewards, because we know that the seeds are going to outlive us. The seeds in my bundle are going to outlive me as a human. And so who's the next person in my line to take care of them, right? And so, what we can do is we can create cultures of transition that can bring forth these type of garden again. And all of you are invited to be a part of that, to increase the use of polyculture, land-raised seeds, and engaging in the coevolutionary dance of seed keeping to contribute to this mycelial network of growing diversity that's critical to all life. And it's a fundamental skill that all of our grandparents and ancestors engaged in at some point. And so each one of you is a descendant of people who had heirloom seeds that have cultural memory and connection. And so I invite you to ask yourself the same question that I did, which was, what were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors at that time? I love to make memes. And so here we have a meme to end it, which is, here's how I started in my journey, and here's how it's going. This is a beautiful ancestral squash called Buffalo Creek that's grown in my beautiful polyculture gardens at home. And you too, if you engage in this work, can have a living room that looks like this. This is my living room in the fall. My kids have grown up in this madness, but there's usually corn and squash and all kinds of things all over the place, but it sure is a beauty to behold. And so this is part of that, creating those cultures who honor seeds and food as relatives. And so I really hope that you all are inspired to do this work. And here is a picture of me and my daughter, who she's 18 now. This picture is a little outdated, but as just a reminder that from our traditional community, we always say that we don't own the seeds or the earth, but we borrow them from our children. And so in the grand lineage of seed keepers who came before me and came before us, in this time, may we thank them and make renewed commitment for those yet to come. So I'd love for you guys to stay in touch. Here's my my email and my website, and I do a lot of seed love songs on Instagram. And so, yeah, feel free to follow me there, and I'll pass it back over to Sydney.
Rowan, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful presentation. Everything about it, the slides, the photos, the information that you shared. Thank you endlessly. It's just amazing. I think we have probably about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. It looks like we have one question in the Q&A box. Kate has asked if you could speak to seeds marketed as quote unquote heirloom that might be found in big box stores like Home Depot, Lowe's, etc.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's so interesting, because I feel like when I started my journey of seed keeping like 25 years ago, it was at a time where heirloom wasn't like a household thing, but now we can find heirloom tomatoes in restaurants and in Safeway or grocery stores or even Walmart. There's been such a shift, I think, over the last 25, 30 years, largely due to the fact that, many folks, not even just Indigenous peoples, but all kinds of organic farmers and folks have been advocating for the importance of heirlooms and land races, et cetera, in our food system. And so we've seen a lot of heirloom seeds hit the mainstream, right? So we see them in supermarkets, and we also see them in places like Lowe's and Home Depot, varieties that are indeed heirlooms in a sense that they do have a story and layers of cultural connection, but might not be an heirloom seed necessarily to our family, but they do have a bigger story of where they came from. And so those are valid. And I think, purchasing them or adopting them is always how I say, if I ever go into like a plant nursery, I'm like, I'm adopting all these plants here that I find. Adopting them is just fine. Just keeping that layer of provenance and origin of what the seed packet shares about that particular seed or story. Because I know I used to serve on the board of directors at Seed Savers Exchange, and we would put heirloom seeds in packets and sell them all over the country, hundreds of different varieties. And so those are definitely heirloom seeds. And then you get to add your own layer of heirloom to them, right? So if you start to grow them in your garden, then, you know, for a number of years, then they start to become your own version of that, which isn't to say that you don't keep that history of what came before you, but then you add your own layers to it. So I think that there's so much opportunity to continue to add to the layers of cultural memory and stories that surround our seed. Yeah.
I love that so much. And I think that really ties in nicely to the next question that we've got here from Joan, which is, what does it say about the general United States culture if agriculture is culture and we have toxic farming methodology?
Yeah. I think that's a really great question. And I think it's important to think about because our seeds and our foodways are a reflection of us and our values, right? So so what is the values that the current industrial system places? And it's values, it's devaluing a lot of things, right? It's devaluing life. It's based on extraction and exploitation and a narrowing of the, you know, diverse pool. And it's a lot of control over the environment by humans. And so I think what's so important in those of us who want to see a better future for our children and who want a more values-centered foodways that reflects who we are as people, that is more relational and is less transactional, is more regenerative and more, you know, abundant, is that we continue to work inside of our communities, you know, and begin to reintroduce that value of diversity, right? The reason why a lot of that genetic erosion and diversity narrowed is because a lot of those varieties, the monoculture varieties, do well inside industrial systems, right? And so if we become humans who want to buy things that are diverse and start shifting the culture in that way, I think that we can be a culture of transition that centers diversity and value, and that's reflected by our food systems, I think. And that's why I think I always emphasize that this is culture work for everyone, is like, what are we doing to advocate for diversity in seeds, and why it's so critically important, and why it's important to support local farms who are being those enclaves of diversity for the next generation. So hopefully that answered the question. It's like an interesting reflection. Like sometimes I always think, gosh, like those monoculture hybrid seeds, like what culture are they reflecting? And I think most of us don't align with that culture, right? And so what are we doing to advocate for a different culture inside of agriculture that does mirror and extend the values that we have in the world that we want for our children? So
thank you so much for that response. And we have another question that is in the Q&A that asks, if you have issues with certain pests like deer, groundhogs, etc., and how do you manage those pests? But I also want to expand this question and thinking about integrated pest management, right, and other practices in which we can live in slightly more harmony, at least a little bit more of harmony with the animals that inhabit the land around us.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. So we always say, like, you plan a little extra for the other ones, right? So, you know, it's like we as humans don't get to be all the harvesters of everything. So always leaving those wild edges so that those groundhogs and those deer can browse. We always have issues with raccoons in the cornfield. And so like if you plant enough, then it's not an issue. If you're planting on a smaller in a smaller place, you know, fencing might be helpful just to sort of keep the animals from completely devouring everything. But I think it goes hand in hand with wild landscape management. I think sometimes our wild animal relatives are being squeezed like into smaller and smaller parcels of wild land. And so sometimes they do end up heading into our gardens because they don't have as much access to the land base to forage and to do their own thing. But yes, we are always kind of in a seasonal sort of dance with, okay, you gotta get some of it, but not all of it. And yeah, so it happens. We, you know, and we definitely have a couple farm cats that help try and keep the gophers at bay. Yeah.
Well, Rowen, thank you so much for this amazing Q&A. Yeah, I wish we had more time to continue talking with you and learning from you. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen again. Let me find my presentation. Share. Can you see this? And I'm not sure. Hold on one
I
second.
can see it. I can see it, Sydney, but I think you need to get it into like full mode. Like,
Okay, great. Yeah.
yeah.
Give me 1 second. Um, Sorry, wasn't prepared. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so we can, for the sake of knowledge sharing, we have a brand new resource that we want to hand over to all of you. You're the very first group of people that have access to this resource. So it's saving seeds from your pollinator garden, identifying harvestable seeds, collecting them, processing your seeds, storing and sharing. And then we also have a section here where you can click on the hyperlink to learn more about the Indigenous SeedKeepers Network and support the work that they do. You can find a link to this resource in the chat, and we'll also be sending out a copy of this to all of you who registered for this event sometime in the very, very near future. So with that, thank you so much to Rowen. I can't thank you enough. It's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you and to share this space with you. Thank you to everyone for coming. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to email us at community@nwf.org.